Okay, I think we can start this afternoon session with a lecture on challenges of sensitivity analysis. Have you seen the organizers are so kind that they organized a rainstorm on purpose to keep you in the room to listen to this talk? Without further delay, I'll give it. First of all, I would like to say that if you want to look at the slides, even in the course of the presentation, they are already online on my website. Yes? What can I do about that? Can we close the window or something? Okay, and this website is very easy to find because it's just my name. You just digit my name and you will find it on Google. And you have also materials online. Additionally, during the presentation, you may find these icons. And the purpose of these icons is to say that material is available on the same website, or that the Wikipedia entry is instructive, so that you may want to look at Wikipedia for that particular topic. I made a point of not repeating what I told 3 years ago in Nice, so I'll try to discuss things which are new with respect to that time. I don't know that not all of you were in Nice, of course, but all the same for those who were there. So what happened in this period? What happened is that our book on sensitivity analysis have been pirated so that they are now freely available on the web, on the Russian LibGen website, but a copy is also available on my website. I'm sorry for Wiley, but this is now freely available. So if you want to use this material for your lessons, you don't need to buy the book. It also happened that there has been an increasing recognition of the need and usefulness of sensitivity analysis overall, and in particular, thanks to the effort of a number of colleagues, some of which are in the room, like Stefano and William, we managed to convince the European Commission to mention extensively sensitivity analysis and sensitivity auditing in their own guidelines for impact assessment. So if you go to the European Commission page on smart regulation, at the page corresponding to the tools and impact assessment toolbox, you will find plenty of material and reference, which in a sense can be useful to you because in this way, if you use sensitivity analysis, you can say, according to the guidelines, if you do this in the context of impact assessment, of course, for some policy-related study, okay? So this is the steps of sensitivity analysis as written in this document, and you can recognize that there is a clear input from the friend at the JRC. So is select one output of interest, and also interesting that we managed to include element of participatory methods. The idea that the discussion on the distribution, on the assumption, has to be done with the broadest group of stakeholders. It wasn't obvious that they would pick up, and it was picked up. So we are happy about that. And so we iterate. I would say this is a fairly good checklist of what should be done in the context of impact assessment. And the same happened for sensitivity auditing, which for those of you who don't know is an extension of sensitivity analysis, especially tailored to policy assessment cases. When you have to defend your work to a higher level of standards because you will have contradictory evidence put against you by opponents, then you need to be more robust, more prepared to defend your analysis, okay? And there are references here. Also on this, there is a lot on the website of the impact assessment, on the same document. And so they mentioned that in a sense, they have a definition of a wicked problem. What is a wicked problem? A problem where people don't agree on what the problem is. So they say, when you have this class of problem, sensitivity auditing can can be done. And of course, sensitivity analysis is part of sensitivity auditing, of course. And so also this kind of sensitivity is more invasive in the sense that it asks you to consider very carefully the assumption, considering the framing assumption, the structural assumption. We will have example later on. But if you want to make an investigation on the safety of a technology and you do a cost-benefit analysis, you may think of it as neutral, but in fact the cost-benefit analysis already corresponds to a framing of the issue in terms of economic feasibility and convenience. So it's a particular framing, right? But there could be other framings, you know, ethical, religious, political. So just to be aware that each analysis corresponds to a given view of reality. Then it's mentioned that you do this in order to be open and so on and so forth. So I would say that I was very pleasantly surprised overall. Here, there is this issue of trust, which is very important. We go back to the issue during my presentation, and the element of anticipation. Why are you going to do this? Not because you are good, but because you want to anticipate a criticism which could eventually invalidate your own work. Okay, so if you do it, you are smart in a sense. And then also this illusion of false precision, of false accuracy. You want to do this in order to try to give a number even when you cannot give a number. This is also an important concept, I think. Sometimes, especially in the organization in which I've been working and William and Stefan are still working, this is the imperative to quantify. You have to quantify. But sometimes really you cannot quantify, no? I mean, sometimes whatever number we produce is a silly number. It's like, you know, and the solution is 42, like, you know, the Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy. So this also has been retained in this document. Okay, let's move on. Unfortunately, in spite of all this success, still there isn't very much sensitivity analysis done in the field. So, and furthermore, some sensitivity analysis, the few sensitivity analyses which are done are very often of a non-satisfactory quality. And you may remember this argument was already discussed in Nice, but we made a more recent paper with another student of ISPRA who's not here today, Federico Ferretti. And so we again looked at how much paper use one factor at a time. We always say that nobody should ever use this approach for sensitivity analysis because this approach substantially is non-explorative. It can be easily shown, I'll show you in a moment, that if you are, for instance, in 10 dimensions and you use a factor of moving one factor at a time, you leave more than 99% of the space of the input totally unexplored, which doesn't make really any sense. So it's really a malpractice which should be eliminated. And it's surprising in a sense, you know, but not many people think about that, but still it is true. And you will remember from those of you who were in Nice that you can easily prove this by showing that if you do one factor at a time, you never move away from the sphere in the space of the input parameter. But when this sphere becomes an hypersphere and the cube becomes an hypercube, for instance, in 10 dimensions, the volume of the sphere becomes negligible compared to the volume of the cube. This is one of the many consequences of the curse of dimensionality. And if you have some geometric difficulty to see this point, imagine that the cube multiply the number of corners so that you have a cube with many corners, like a hedgehog, no? Un porcupin. And the volume of this object is all in the corners, right? So the core, the sphere, fractionally becomes very small. That's why That's the ratio of the volume of the sphere divided the volume of the hypercube in function of the number of dimension k. And you can see that goes quickly to 0. Okay, this was the argument. But so not only that, we said sensitivity analysis is not done well, but it's also not done at all. This is a plot showing that somewhat in the order of 1% of modeling paper include a sensitivity analysis, but only 1 in 1,000 has some kind of global assay. By global assay, we mean sensitivity analysis non-OAT. So it could be regression, could be emulators, could be sensitivity indices, could be moment-independent methods, whatever. No? We search for all instances of an approach, meta-modeling, and so on. We search for all the approach to sensitivity which were not OAT. So it's still, and also you can appreciate that there is a lot of differences among disciplines. Huh? So economics is the worst. Is any economist in the room? Economics is the worst, and medicine is the better. Okay, in terms of using again global sensitivity analysis. Okay, but I would say that perhaps this bad practice which we meet in our own discipline is only part of a broader picture of bad practices in the use of mathematical and statistical tool overall. And I'll try now to build a case for this. You may have heard that there is a lot of discussion on the use of p-value, no? The p-test, which is used in an experiment to check what would be the chance of obtaining the result by pure chance as opposed to having measured an effect. And there is, in this use of the p-test, apparently lots which is wrong. You may have heard of p-hacking. Who heard, let's do a test. Who heard the term p-hacking? Can you raise your hand? No, okay. So p-hacking would be an experimenter who stretches his data to get a significant level for p, and he can do this by including or excluding outliers, okay? Running the simulation longer till the p is obtained, no? It may be in a fluctuation, and in a variety of ways, let's say, okay? Not necessarily when you see a paper which is not reproducible is the result of p-hacking. This could be selection bias, but okay, we could discuss this, but this is, anyhow, p-hacking is now considered to be so serious that, the American Statistical Association, AMA, made a statement on this a few months ago. So all this stuff is quite recent. They made a statement to tell statisticians and how this should be used, so that statisticians could teach anyone else how this should be used. But among statisticians, there is also a lot of discussion on these methods, and it is so that 20 top statisticians decided to comment on this statement. So there is quite some disagreement, even in the craft of statistics. And then there are broader discussion and consideration of statistical malpractice, which you can find in this literature from Nature, which make people think that something is rotten, not in Denmark, but in the heart of the statistical practice system. So much so that if you read the New Scientist, which is a British magazine, it's not a scientific magazine, it's a magazine about science which target non-academical people, let's say mostly teachers, okay? But they talk about the statistical sausage factory, and they also kind of accuse statistics of not being up to the standards which would be needed. We were not particularly convinced of this reading. We wrote a letter to New Scientist with a couple of colleagues, Jerry Ravets and Silvio Fontovic, and the letter was accepted, and so it was published on the journal, on the New Scientist. And in this letter we say, listen, we suspect that a certain loss of craft skill cannot be specific to statistics. There isn't any reason why a loss of craft skill in doing science must be limited to statistics. Probably statistics is why you see it, because statistics is the coal phase of research. No? You look at the result through the lenses of statistics when you see a paper. You don't see all what goes on in the lab beforehand, most often. No? And we said that this crisis has deep roots and so on and so forth, but we will discuss a bit more of this. So of course you don't read this. This is just for you to tell where to find it. So we were discussing for a long time how serious this crisis is. And we wrote a book this year, it was published this year, in March this year. And in this book we discuss the crisis of science and science practice. And we say that this is really a broad crisis. It affects the use of metrics, it affects the peer review system, it affects the reproducibility, it affects as well and especially the use of science to recommend on prescribed policy. How are we doing with the audio? Can you hear me now? Can you hear my voice now, or is the rain? Yeah. Okay. Well, anyhow, you would read the slides. If you don't want to read the book, which is nevertheless a very small book, and very cheap because it only costs 9 euros on Amazon. But if you don't want to read the book, this article is online on the conversation, contains somewhat a summary of the thesis of the book. I won't have time to tell you about the book, but some elements will come out. The crisis of science is so evident that even a journal like The Economist in 2013 devoted the cover to the crisis of science. This is October 2013. And they had an excellent, I think they did an excellent job on this, also because they brought this to the attention of everyone. And the book, all the same, we try to say that the crisis element of epistemology, so scientific methods, but also metaphysical. Let's say, we argue in the book that part of the problem is that science is taken as a metaphysics, like a religion, if you wish. No? You may have heard the term scientism to denote this particular deviation of use of science. When science becomes a belief system and not a method to check on the truth of given belief. So this kind of logical mistake. And we say that the crisis will be particularly painful in certain particular point, in evidence-based policy, very evidently. Then in the idea that science is advocated to take us out of many crises. And this is, you may have heard the term techno-optimism in this relation. And then the idea that, the last one is perhaps the more dangerous. Many scientists are convinced that they produce the fact. And hence, because they produce the fact, the policy must act on the fact. And this is a very dangerous position. It's a very maximalistic position for a variety of reasons. One being that facts can be seen in different ways. There can be different facts to be looked at. And the other being the science may contribute to a policy decision, but never determine a policy decision. I think in no country is bare in its constitution that the decision will be taken on the basis of science, full stop. Okay, but nevertheless is very much widespread. So these two authors have done a lot of work to examine different dimensions of the crisis. Ioannidis is a statistician, and Begley is active in clinical research, and they have found that the crisis in medicine is terrible, which is in a sense surprising because medicine is a field where they have done the best effort to ensure the quality of their findings. Before we had evidence-based policy, we had evidence-based medicine. So counterfactual methods, which are considered as a gold standard in policy assessment, they were very much tried in medicine before they were tried anywhere else. So it is surprising and sad in a sense that the field which has done the most to make sure that the result of is the result of a given quality, is also the field which is more affected by the crisis. According to this author, the crisis is due to the fact that people don't use good practices, and this could be good for us because we work all the time to provide the good practices. And then the system of incentive, whereby you had to publish a lot every year, you know? This is a paper machine which creates a system of incentive which generates bad science. Okay? We believe that these factors are very important, but still we believe that there are other factors which are also important, and about which I cannot talk much now, otherwise this would take the entire lecture. In summary, the story is the following, and the story is described into these three very important books. The idea that science was born as an element of enlightenment, as an element of emancipation from religion and superstition, and was practiced in communities. And now we have a science which is practiced mostly for progress, for growth, no? For profit, and where science was once small, it is now very large indeed. So all these authors, in a sense, say you cannot expect that what worked in little science will work in big science. Okay? For the moment, I leave it there. But this is the thesis of the small book which we have published. And by the way, this J.D. Ravetz, Jean-François Lyotard, you all know, and Philip Mirowski. Philip Mirowski wrote also a very beautiful book on that, called Science Smart. It's an allusion to Walmart. You know? When the science becomes a market, a lot of things happen which decrease the quality of science. Okay, let me leave it there. In economics, there is also a very active discussion going on in the moment. Because some people feel that economics has also made a lot of mistakes. Of course, you all heard the story that the economists could not predict the crisis. Paul Romer wrote a very beautiful paper talking about mattiness. Mattiness. Who heard about mattiness? No, the other economists. Yeah, okay, but if you are economists, you heard the story of mattiness, and mattiness is when you use mathematics, but in fact you are using mathematics only to push some ideology underneath, okay? So it's a cosmetic use of mathematics, in other words. And this is Paul Romer. And after he wrote this paper, surprisingly, Paul Romer was elected chief economist of the World Bank. And I must say that this was really a surprise, because when he published this paper, he made a lot of enemies in the profession. Judith Carey is also following this discussion in science in general, and my friend Eric Reinert has written about science of economics becoming scholastic for an excess of mathematics in a cyclical fashion. And all these papers are available. If you want, you can go and check them. They are easily available. What is for me a cause of consternation is that those organizations which should have been among the first to notice the crisis because they work on science advice, so they work on system and methodology to provide advice to policy, those organizations are totally silent on the crisis. This report from the OECD, 2015, not a single word. The other report from the UNESCO, this year, not a single word. There is no crisis. Nothing is happening, which is, in a sense, extremely surprising. There has been a big discussion on whether scientists were helping skepticism or the opposite. And there has been a big discussion, especially in the UK, after Brexit, because they said, oh, look, people really didn't care at what the experts were saying. So we now live in the era of post-truth policy. And this year, the UK, the British dictionary, the Oxford Dictionary declared post-truth the word of the year. This is surprising, eh? Post-truth is the word of the year for the Oxford Dictionary. Okay, here is a small piece where this issue of expertise and trust is discussed. No? So, are the people who are wrong because they don't trust the expert, or did the expert do something wrong so that the people wouldn't or shouldn't trust them? Okay, I just leave for you, but this is open, also available online. Actually, there is a lot of linkages between quantification, which is what we do all the time, no? We give the numbers, and trust. And this scholar, Theodore Porter, has written a very interesting book on that, in which he made a number of points. One is that numbers can be a way of governing, no? A way of acquiring power, a way of getting legitimacy. I am doing something useful and good because I'm using a good evidence, and I have numbers to back this, no? And in this way, I acquire an authority which otherwise I would not have, no? So this quantifying, this providing numbers, makes me in a sense neutral, right? I'm not taking a particular position, I'm looking at the numbers, and the numbers tell a story, and I'm telling you the story. So this is a position which is very... Let me make you an example. Take the OECD. You know that the OECD runs the PISA program, no? For literacy and mathematics and science, every 3 years or so. You know PISA study? Yeah. Okay. By running the PISA study, which is something very useful because it makes available country comparison for different educational systems, the OECD also acquired a lot of authority in educational policy, okay, which the OECD did not have before. So there is indeed a relation between providing those numbers and acquiring power and legitimacy. But as I said, all this is very much linked to an issue of trust. So for this to work, people have to trust the OECD. Okay? Most people trust the OECD. Many people don't trust the OECD for a variety of reasons, mostly political and ideological. But trust is important. And the way Porter described this issue of trust is by comparing two very famous organizations of engineers. So this is you, Bertrand. One is les ingénieurs des ponts et des chaussées, and the other is the US Army Corps engineers. Both corps are manned by good people. At a point in time in the past, they even studied on the same books, which were French by the time. The old literature, no, for instance, on what multi-criteria analysis, what was French before it was American. So in the USA, they either studied in German economics or in French engineering. We all know that. And the difference between these two is that, in a sense, the French engineer enjoyed the support and the trust of most of their countries, and so they could do very reasonable and effective quantification when it was needed, and when it was needed, they didn't even feel the need to quantify. By contrast, the US Army engineers were operating in an environment where quantification was mandatory. There was a lot of competition between different regulatory authorities at federal level and state level, so they were really between a rock and a hard place, and so they really had to produce those assessments anyhow for legislative purposes, and often those assessments were of a very poor quality. So really, you can see here how trust and quantification are very much related. Okay. Now I should say that sensitivity analysis and sensitivity auditing could help to tackle these controversial times in which we are living. I think that we can do something useful by using sensitivity analysis. Is very good for demystifying shoddy evidence, poor evidence, bad science. It's very, for instance, in the field of modeling, if we are presented with a modeling study, we can do a sensitivity analysis to see whether this study makes any sense or not. So we could also use these to engage with different constituencies, no? To negotiate the quality of the numbers we use and the framings. Opening up the frames, as I said, no? Every assessment corresponds to a frame. So if you want to do something useful, you try to look at different frames, no? To look at an issue with the eyes of many different stakeholders, holding different norms and beliefs. So, and I believe this can be done. In this old book written by these two old scholars, Silvio Funtovic and Jerry Ravets, they have this is a very old book which is also been pirated by the Russian hackers. So you also find this book on my website and also on the Russian website. And they have an epilogue in which they say the numbers are nevertheless still somehow an esoteric knowledge. And that only when you will be able to quality control the uncertainty in the use of these numbers, you will have done a step in demystifying the use of number and helping the democratization of expertise. Democratization of expertise is again something related to the fact that when science is to be used for policy, you must be confronted with the stakeholders, so the science itself should be done in the context of extended peer community of people. So this is something where we can play possibly a role. And we also discuss in terms of quantitative storytelling. So if the frames are so important, the frames can be expressed in terms of story, in terms of narrative. And so what is quantitative storytelling? Well, you could say that this is a truism because different people look with different glasses, but it's also an exhortation from philosophers. But quantitative storytelling can also be seen as an extension of sensitivity analysis and auditing, which is the formalization of the process of expanding the universe of the possible frames. And then it can be useful in the context of working with extended peer communities. This was Nietzsche. In this small segment, Nietzsche says that you know the story of the view from nowhere, no? In journalism, it's very important that you should have a view from nowhere, meaning that when you look at an issue, you have to be as neutral as possible, no? Because you're not looking for... And this is the opposite story. Nietzsche says, only if you can look at something from everywhere, you understand something, no? Only if you consider the different possible way of seeing, then you know something about something. Okay? So this is a bit the reverse of the view from nowhere ideal. But of course this is Nietzsche, so Nietzsche said everything and the opposite of everything, but nevertheless this is interesting. What are frames? I wanted to offer you a few frames, ideas, so that you understand what I'm talking about. I don't want to be too philosophical. I said, when you do cost-benefit analysis, you adopt a frame. The frame that the usefulness and the justification for something, practice for instance, or a type of production, is to be seeked into elements of gain, profits, and so on. But this is a particular view framing, and the so-called deep ecologists, those writing in the 70s, were very aware that this is a very dangerous road to go. And if you want to read more, this book is also available on my website. There's a chapter on why ecologists should not fall into the trap of cost-benefit analysis. This is a book on hypocognition and frames. You heard the expression tax relief. The expression tax relief is a frame because it gives you the impression that tax is a kind of a disease or a burden from which you seek relief. No? But someone might say, come on, taxes are also what pays for, you know, for this room, for the infrastructure, for the road, for the army, and many other things. But by using this expression, by framing the issue of taxes as a burden, in this book of Lakoff, the Republican Party in America managed to convince people that, you know, the government should be small and taxes should be taken away. So, frames are very important into the making of politics. And if you want to read a book about that, Lakoff and Schiller have published recently a book called Fishing for Food, which explain the implication of this for policy, which is really very, very interesting. But okay, on GMO, I mentioned this before maybe, on GMO, those who propose GMO frame GMO in terms of something which is safe for consumption. And hence, because it's safe for consumption, why don't you want to eat it? But this is a frame. Someone else, might come and say, no, I don't believe that they are particularly unsafe. I don't like them because they are made by Monsanto. No? So this is a different frame. But if you read very often, instrumentally, I would say, and disingenuously, the issue of GMO is only presented as an issue of food safety, as if, from their safety, we were bound to conclude that we must consume them, which is not, because, we still live in a polity. We may have political reason why we don't want to eat something which is patented by Monsanto. I'm not saying that you have to have this belief, but I hope that you concur with me that this belief is legitimate. Okay, but again, the framing is very... Frames are also, as I said, used very much instrumentally. There is an aspect of frame which is, in a sense, natural, and that is that you must make a story. Because if you don't use stories, if you don't use narratives, people don't make sense of what you are talking about. So in this sense, Steve Reiner said that, well, after all, hypocognition is unavoidable because you have to compress reality into pills, narrative stories, which people would metabolize. But then the other aspect of it is that this is used to eliminate what is known as uncomfortable knowledge. Things of which you don't want to hear, or things which go against the main narrative. And so, there is a lot of intention to put it on a side. And this is very nice. This is from the paper of Steve Reiner. How do you deal with uncomfortable knowledge? Well, you may say that it's not there. This is not a problem. Or you may say, well, it's a minor problem. You are trying to minimize it. Or you may say, well, I'm working on it. So this is a kind of diversion because, in fact, I'm working on something else. And the last one, which concerns us here today, is the one to use a model and say, yes, we know the problem, and we have, in fact, written a very beautiful model which worked on the problem, and the model flags that we are going in the right direction. But in this case, you are working on the model and not on the problem. Okay, so this is a theory of displacement, using mathematical modeling as a way to substitute the model for the reality and reckon on the model instead of reckoning on the reality. You may also say that uncomfortable knowledge and the way it is handled define how close you are to being an ancien regime. There are definitions of ancien regime as a system which is not able to cope with signals of stress. Okay, so the broader the number of signals you refuse to process, the closer you are to an ancien regime. Okay, this makes a lot of sense to me, but we can discuss this over dinner maybe. And then eventually, when you are surprised that people don't change their mind easily, this slide offers a possible explanation. Okay, so we propose quantitative storytelling as a way of opening the frame. I don't want to insist too much on that. And then, of course, maybe the quality of the quantitative appraisal becomes simpler, so checking only at possibility and impossibility, but you find it in the book in the second chapter if you want to read it. We also trying to write a list of rules which one might want to follow to do this properly. Those are rules for responsible quantification. And we say, again, as we discussed before, that you shouldn't quantify under duress. You shouldn't be forced to quantify. You should always think that there is always one more way of looking at an issue. You should not hide assumptions under the carpet. And the last one is a bit subtle. Each measure should have a stable external reference. Whenever we process a statistical indicator, we should keep in mind whether what that indicator was pointing to, has it moved or not? Or has it become something else? Because this may also well happen. You all know the law of Goddard, right? Goddard law. When something becomes an indicator, people adapt to the indicator. So what is being indicated changes as a result of being indicated, no? This would be an instance where the external reference of your measurement is doing something, is going away, is changing. No? And this should be kept in mind when you try to do quantification. But one could make many examples, a bit more sophisticated, but especially in ecology, you could make, or in sustainability science, you could make many examples of this. Okay, so how can sensitivity analysis play a role? This is again a checklist. Today is a day of checklist. And I say that there are a few secrets of sensitivity analysis which we should master. One is that, this you heard many times already, yeah? Sensitivity analysis is not run on a model, but on a model once applied to a question. So the sensitivity analysis cannot be an attribute of the model. It's an attribute of a certain use of a particular model. And the corollary of this is that sensitivity analysis is also much better used in the negative sense, what Nassim Taleb calls via negativa. So it's much better to start by the assumption that a given inferential procedure is not successful, or will not be successful, or is not possible, and then see whether, this is or not the case. Huh? This would be a sort of null hypothesis in modeling. This is a suggestion which was made many years ago by Naomi Oreskes. So it's better to be in a setting of falsification than in a set of confirmation. But normally we do the opposite. We are aware. Normally we try to use a model to show that we can do something. And the second secret is that you shouldn't use sensitivity analysis to attract attention on certain uncertainty to the detriment of all the others. Okay? So you shouldn't be trying to use this to swipe under the rug, as in the comic here. The third one is very tricky because it says, imagine that you do your best with your model, apply to a question, and you don't get it. It doesn't go, it doesn't work. Your model does not allow you to make any useful inference. Then when this happens, what one should do is either to change the question or to change the model. This would be the only logical way to tackle the issue, though very often we don't do that because we are in love with our own mathematical model. Okay, there could be references for this, but in the interest of time. And of course, as we all know, sensitivity analysis is very good to find even stupid mistakes in the computer code. This is a Lubarsky code of cybernetic entomology. There is always one more back. And global sensitivity analysis, OAT, no, will not help you much. But global sensitivity analysis is very demanding for the model and is very good for spotting things which don't work. And then this is a bit my obsession, that you should tell people why you are doing it in a certain way. Because as you see from this slide, you can do it in very many different ways, but the reader must be told why are you using this particular technique to define importance. Because importance is a very generic term. What does it mean, important? You are important for me, okay, but what does it mean really? No? Clearly, if you think carefully about that, you normally can try to justify or select a particular method based on the question which you are asking from your model. This should be really kept in mind. There are cases in which sensitivity indices are perfect. There are cases in which mode-independent techniques are better. I mean, you really have to, but you have to be able to explain why. Otherwise, importance is a generic concept, and you can use 100 different methods and get 100 different definition of importance. And this is not very useful because this is very easy to be challenged, okay? And especially what I find terrible when I review papers, when I see people who do sensitivity analysis by changing each parameter of a fixed percentage. What does this mean? I mean, does this mean that we are truly uncertain of the same amount in percentage for each factor? How can this be justified? This is really a very bad practice. Now, this is my last slide, so I stay within the time, and we have some time for discussion. I know that you are digesting, so you are, you are not your full self, but and I thought that also because maybe of digestion, you are now asking, what the hell did I say? So this slide tries to summarize how the different points of my talk were related. So we say sensitivity analysis is recognized as important, but it's not very much used, and when it is used, it is not very good, most often. It is part of a general disease, it's a loss of craft skill, it is a wider crisis of science. We have discussed this in some detail. So especially the quality control, no? So use of metrics, peer review, and all that. Quantification and trust are linked, but because quantification and trust are linked, then we go to the discussion of the post-truth. As quantifier, we have a high responsibility. In this sense, we may truly be responsible for loss of trust if we don't do our work properly. Sensitivity analysis and auditing can help to demystify bad science, to fight hypocognition, and I also offered a few secrets, inverted commas, of sensitivity analysis in this direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Really exciting. So thank you. I have many remarks, but I will only give two of them. First one is about what you said about the fact that medicine managed to reach this gold standard of evidence-based medicine, which is not the case in other fields. And I have a personal opinion about this, and I wanted to have because, in my opinion, statisticians share this particularity, this distinguishing feature with doctors is the common use of inductive reasoning, because that's the kind of reasoning on which statistics are based, and that's also the case for the clinical practices on which all the medicine is built. So that's what, in my opinion, doctors and statisticians have in common that is different from other sciences that are based on deductive reasoning. And that might be a reason why this kind of reasoning and this kind of methods are not widespread in other fields. And my second remark is that one of your slides mentioned something like the end of the truth or something like that about
the end of what? The end of the Cartesian dream, you mean?
The end of an era where people believe that there is one truth that can be found.
Yes.
And I think that there's someone, a French anthropologist who studied this. I don't know if you know him. I wanted to know if you know this man who wrote a book about this in French. His name is Paul Jorion. He's known because he gave
Can you say the name again? Because I can hear you very badly. Can you say the name, please?
Sorry, Paul Jorion.
Ah, okay.
He's well known, but for
Yeah,
other
yeah.
things, and he wrote a book which is called in French Comment la vérité, la réalité furent inventées, which means how truth and reality have been invented, which deals with this topic of
Yeah, but
the
this is like,
existence.
okay.
And
This
it's
is,
I don't know if you know this book, but it's closely linked to all what you said. In fact.
okay. Okay. Unfortunately, I could hear you very badly, but I'll try to make the most
Sorry,
of
sorry
what
for that.
I understood. So, I agree with you 100% on randomized control trial. I didn't say that I agree that they are the gold standard. I said they are considered to be the gold standard. If you read chapter 2 of the book, I have all a section where we criticize RFC, because again, we are very much against this kind of magic bullets. No? So we use randomized control trial, problem solved. No, this is a technical solution, which may or may not work. But then again, they bump into this idea of the multiplicity of frames. Typically, in a randomized control trial, how target a given population, you have the faintest idea how this may work in a different population. So this, really you have to be very careful before you sell something as a gold standard. The gold standard is to use your brain, I think, fundamentally. So I agree 100%. Well, the second point is obvious. I mean, we are all the literate people, or people, let me say it this way. All these people with a decent humanistic training know that this is not true, that facts are not facts. Facts are the result of a process of negotiation among actors, and even in our small activity of scientists, you may believe that you have found a fact, but from the moment in which you have found it, and you can convince someone else that you have found it, of the very, very same fact, it can be quite a long path. Bruno Latour has described this very, very beautifully, in his book on how science works. Science works when someone tries to make a fact, and then someone else makes a better fact, and there is a terrible fight, and then in the very flamboyant style of Latour says, the bigger laboratory wins. But this is phenomenology. No, this is Husserl. What do we know? This is a fundamental question. What do we know? So what do we know is a very delicate matter which cannot be resolved by science with a big S, which would be what we call science. So I agree with you. Yeah, sure. Peter, maybe I don't know.
Thank you, Andrea. Very stimulating talk. I'd like to pick up on induction and hypothetical. This is very interesting. I'll talk about it on Friday. But if you look at the history of science, some of the things that you have raised, I think, come about because of this background. Now, the hypothetico-deductive approach came from Popper. And Popper was considering laboratory science, where you can plan experiments. And the areas that many of us work in, you can't conduct experiments, let alone plan them. And then you look at the history of science and you go back, deduction wasn't used. In fact, it was a dirty word. Newton said, hypotheses non fingo. I deplore hypotheses. I don't do hypotheses.
Nullius in verba.
And he said that for a very good reason, because he's saying, you look at the data that you've got, you collect it as best you can. In the end, the model, whatever you're doing, is going to be dependent on the data. The hypothetico-deductive says, you set up a hypothesis, and then you fit it to the data. The inductive says, you take the data, and you find the model out from the data. Now, these are quite different processes. So the climate models I'll talk about on Friday, these are hypothetico-deductive models in an area where you can't plan experiments. And they're huge models. The hypotheses are huge. Nobody can ever prove those hypotheses. Nobody will ever prove the hypotheses that the climate scientists are making. I don't disagree with the climate scientists, but nobody can prove these models are just too big. And if you take induction and you look at the data, it tells you something a little bit different. So I think the point you made is this background of science.
I have half an hour, right? No, I'm kidding. No, well, the story is, of course, yes. Before I forget, I agree with that. But eventually, nobody believes seriously in Popper anymore. Not because Popper was wrong. Popper made a very valuable effort to go beyond the logical positivism by, saying that you cannot prove anything by accumulating evidence, because you could also meet the black swan, and it could also be some kind of thing, one single observation which falsify all the rest. So we need something else, and he came out with this falsification hypothesis, the hypothetical deductive model. But then it was totally demolished by Thomas Kuhn, who proved that science doesn't demolish anything. If scientists love their particular hypothesis, they will never depart of it till maybe the main actor in this discipline dies. No, we all know that. The science proceeds one funeral at a time, and then Then other people intervene. Lakatos tried to defend the work of Thomas Kuhn, and Feyerabend proven even more radically that in science you don't have a method. It never was. For which we can make a lot of examples showing how heterogeneous is the way in which we form our knowledge. But maybe, on this I conclude, the best description was given by Francis Bacon. He made this metaphor of the ant and the spider. The spider is a hypothetical deductive. It starts from a core and goes around using his imagination to sew a web, no? And on the other side, the ant on the ground accumulates one grain at a time, no? And he says that the flying bee, is a good metaphor of how science should work, being a bit spider and a bit ant, no? Going continuously reversing this kind of perspective. Francis Bacon had a very good idea about science in 17 for 20 something, 1620 something.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
To,
Thank you.